You are evil." The words sliced through the air like a blade, sharp and deliberate, echoing against the marble walls of the chamber. For a moment, time itself seemed to stagger. The clatter of reporters' keyboards froze mid-stroke, camera shutters halted mid-click. Even the hum of whispered conversations cut off, leaving only silence heavy enough to feel like pressure in the lungs. Donald Trump leaned back in his chair, lips curling into a smirk that looked rehearsed. He thrived on chaos, on insults tossed back and forth like cheap currency. To him, this was nothing more than another opening jab, another stage where he could perform his brand of dominance. His eyes swept the crowd with that familiar glint of arrogance, daring anyone to disagree. But the silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's words was not ordinary. It wasn't the awkward lull of a debate pausing for breath. It was heavier, deeper, charged with something the cameras could never fully capture. People were holding their breath. Gasps rippled from the press seats, like the first crack of thunder before a storm. A woman in the back clasped her hand to her mouth. A man fumbled his phone as he tried to capture the moment, his screen reflecting those three words again and again. "You are evil." Trump mistook the stillness for fear. He leaned forward, tapping the table with a smug rhythm, convinced Crockett had overplayed her hand. To him, calling him evil was reckless, a rookie mistake that would only set him up for a counterpunch. He had weathered far worse and turned it into applause lines at rallies. He was sure this moment would be no different, but Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. She wasn't rattled, wasn't backpedaling. There was a steadiness in her eyes that unsettled even those who supported her. She hadn't blurted the words out in anger. She had delivered them like a verdict. The narrator's voice cut through the tension, as if explaining to America what the room itself hadn't yet realized. But in that moment, no one understood. This wasn't a slip of the tongue. It wasn't reckless. It was strategy. The chamber seemed to tilt. Those listening began to sense the shift that Crockett hadn't just challenged Trump. She had cornered him. The word evil wasn't an insult, it was a mirror. And soon, every camera, every microphone, every pair of eyes would force him to look into it. Reporters whispered frantically, their pens scratching faster now, as though documenting history in real time. She called him evil. Did you hear that? Nobody's ever said it to his face like that. On Twitter, the moment was already spreading like fire. Hashtags forming before the echo of her words had fully died. Trump cleared his throat, the smirk still plastered on his face. He was preparing his rebuttal, the usual mix of mockery and disdain. But even he could feel the room wasn't leaning his way. The silence wasn't sympathy for him. It was anticipation. Crockett hadn't come to trade barbs. She had come to set the tone. And the first note she played was a THUND or CLAP. The narrator tightened the lens for the viewer at home. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a collision one woman's courage against a dynasty's arrogance. And what happened after these three words would leave not just the room, not just the cameras, but the entire country in disbelief. The chamber seemed to lean forward, every eye fixed on the stillness between them. The smirk on Trump's face deepened, but there was a flicker brief. Almost invisible, a flash of unease he quickly buried, because Jasmine Crockett had not even begun. Asterisk, the silence after those three words hung like a storm cloud. But beneath it, the stakes of this moment stretched far beyond the four walls of that chamber. America wasn't merely watching a clash of personalities. It was staring into its own fractured reflection. The country stood divided, split down jagged lines of ideology, race, class, and truth itself. On one side, millions clung to a vision of power embodied by Donald Trump. Brash, unyielding, untouchable. To them, his arrogance was not weakness, but strength. A shield against a world they feared was slipping away. On the other, there was a hunger for honesty. For leaders who spoke with clarity and courage, who called corruption by its name instead of dressing it in spin. Jasmine Crockett didn't just step into that chamber as one woman. She stepped in as the voice of that other America, bruised but unbroken, searching for someone unafraid to stand up. And Donald Trump. He represented the opposite pole with startling clarity. He was the embodiment of unchecked arrogance, A man who had built an empire on wealth inherited. Scandals survived and rules bent until they snapped. A man who had turned every courtroom, every hearing, every microphone into another stage for self-preservation. Trump carried himself like the system's ultimate exception, a dynasty immune to accountability. That was the imbalance Jasmine was walking into. One against a juggernaut, truth against machinery. And yet, she wasn't intimidated. She was deliberate. For months, maybe years, she had studied his rhythm, his tactics, the way he used insult to destabilize, the way he wielded smirks as weapons. And when she called him evil, it wasn't just anger breaking loose. It was the trigger she had been holding, waiting for the exact moment when it would land with maximum force. The room could feel it. This wasn't just theater. It was a test of what America still valued, raw arrogance or unflinching dignity. Outside the chamber, the media swarmed like bees shaken from a hive. Satellite trucks lined the streets, anchors rehearsed their breaking news voices, and pundits leaned into microphones ready to spin. They understood instinctively that something bigger than an insult was brewing. This was not the usual volley of sound bites. This was the kind of confrontation that would demand headlines, that would ripple into hashtags, that would force people to take sides. The narrator pressed the weight of it into the audience, because what happens in a single instant can sometimes define an era. This wasn't just a clapback. It was a line drawn in the sand, staring America to decide which side it was on. Crockett's allies knew she hadn't spoken recklessly. She had been waiting, patient, biding her time, knowing that one perfectly chosen moment could cut deeper than 1,000 rehearsed speeches. She had picked this day, this setting, this clash, because she knew millions were watching. Trump still believed he was in control, smirking like a man with cards stacked in his favor. But what he didn't realize, what the world was about to discover, was that Crockett had flipped the script. For once, he wasn't the one dictating the terms of the fight. The tension became unbearable, like a fuse burning toward an unseen explosion. The narrator leaned in, teasing the edge of revelation, and yet Crockett had been waiting for this exact moment. Because what she did next wasn't just about winning an argument. It rewrote the conversation about power in America. The country leaned closer, waiting for the blast to understand why Jasmine Crockett's words carried such weight. You have to understand the man sitting across from her, Donald J. Trump. His presence was larger than life, his shadow stretching across decades of headlines, scandals, and showmanship. But behind the glitz of gold-plated towers and roaring rallies was a figure built on contradictions so glaring they should have collapsed under their own weight. Instead, they hardened into a persona millions admired and millions more despised. Trump branded himself as the champion of law and order. He thundered about criminals in the streets, promised walls and prisons, and cast himself as America's last line of defense against chaos. Yet even as he barked about accountability, his own life spiraled in and out of indictments, lawsuits, and investigations. Courtrooms became as familiar to him as campaign stages, yet somehow he always walked out boasting victory, smirking at cameras as if the law itself bent to his will. The contradiction didn't end there. He was a self-styled patriarch of family values, posing with children in glossy magazine spreads, thundering about the sanctity of marriage. Yet his personal life was a trail of affairs, betrayals, and tabloid confessions that would have ended the careers of lesser men. Storms of scandal followed him, but instead of washing him away, they only seemed to make him more untouchable. For his supporters, his sins were proof of authenticity. He tells it like it is. For his critics, it was maddening proof of double standards. One man could get away with what would destroy anyone else. Asterisk cameras captured the arrogance that tied it all together. On rally stages, he basked in adoration like a king holding court. He mocked opponents with nicknames, distorted faces, flailing arms, turning cruelty into comedy while the crowd roared. In depositions, when questions pressed too close, he leaned back in his chair with that trademark smirk, as if daring the system to do its worst. Even under oath, even under investigation, he radiated the confidence of someone convinced rules didn't apply to him. That was his true gift. Not policy, not strategy, but dominance through humiliation. Trump was a bully in its purest form. He thrived on the spectacle of making others squirm, of turning debates into circuses, making opponents lose composure under his barrage of insults. Every sneer, every jab, every exaggerated imitation was fuel for his base and a nightmare for his rivals. To beat him wasn't just about arguing better. It was about surviving the storm of ridicule he unleashed. And time after time, he walked away unscathed. Rivals left battered, careers ended, reputations shredded. Trump would dust off his suit and strut away, declaring himself the winner. It was a cycle America had come to know too well. Trump provokes, the opponent flails, and the crowd laughs. It was performance art disguised as politics, and it worked. But for millions watching, it was infuriating. They saw the double standards laid bare. Ordinary people paid the price for mistakes far smaller than his, while he strutted free. Ordinary leaders saw their careers destroyed for whispers of scandal, while his roared on with headlines screaming louder than ever. The frustration wasn't just about Trump the man. It was about the system that seemed powerless to hold him accountable. That's why the smirk he flashed at Jasmine Crockett in that chamber carried so much history. It wasn't just a smirk at her. It was the same smirk he had worn for years at journalists. Judges, women, immigrants, veterans, anyone who dared challenge him. It was the smirk of a man convinced he could humiliate yet another opponent and walk away laughing. But this time, the story would not play out the same way. Because while Trump believed humiliation was his strongest weapon, he underestimated what happens when arrogance finally meets a wall it cannot crack. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just another opponent scrambling to defend herself. She wasn't interested in surviving the storm. She was ready to turn it back on him, and so, when she looked him in the eye and said those words, "You are evil," the air shifted. For the first time in years, that smirk faced something it couldn't swallow. Couldn't spin, couldn't shrug off. The country could feel it. Something different was happening. The bully who had thrived on humiliating others was finally staring down someone who refused to. Flinched, and that's why when Crockett finally spoke, the country braced. Asterisk long before Jasmine Crockett ever sat across from Donald Trump, before the cameras, before the microphones. She had lived a life that shaped her into someone who could withstand storms. She wasn't born into wealth, nor groomed by dynasties. Her story didn't begin in gilded towers or Ivy League boardrooms. It began in ordinary neighborhoods, where the ceilings sometimes leaked when it rained, and where ambition wasn't handed down, it had to be earned. Jasmine grew up watching the way power worked in America. She saw how opportunity didn't come evenly, how some doors opened automatically for the privileged while others were bolted shut for those without the right name or bank account. And she made herself a promise. If the world wasn't going to hand her a place at the table, she would carve one out herself. Those early years taught her resilience. She knew what it felt like to be underestimated, to walk into a room and see eyes glance past her as if she didn't belong. She carried that memory like a quiet fire, a reminder of what she was fighting against, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or told they weren't enough. The path forward was anything but smooth. Law school meant endless nights in cramped apartments, poring over books until her eyes burned, working jobs on the side just to afford the basics. Where others had safety nets, she had determination. Every late-night coffee, every rent check barely scraped together, every setback that could have broken her. They all hardened her resolve. Her entry into public service wasn't met with applause. The system didn't welcome her with open arms. Instead, she was tested, doubted, second-guessed. She faced rooms where her words were dismissed before they left her mouth, where colleagues with far less knowledge interrupted her with confidence born only from entitlement. But Jasmine didn't back down. She learned to speak louder, clearer, sharper. Each interruption became another reason to sharpen her blade. Each dismissal became fuel. There were moments that would have driven many people out of the fight, losing cases that should have been won, watching injustice unfold while rules and technicalities tied her hands, facing vitriol from people who saw her not as a person but as a symbol they resented. She absorbed it all and kept moving because she understood something essential. Dignity doesn't come from victory alone. It comes from standing your ground even when victory seems impossible. Her rise wasn't meteoric. It was painstaking. One step, one battle, one refusal to be silenced at a time. And along the way, she built a reputation not for politicking, but for persistence. She wasn't the polished, backslapping politician who smoothed every edge to fit the mold. She was real, sometimes blunt, always fearless, unafraid to say the things others only whispered. For everyday Americans tired of the same rehearsed lines, she was a reflection of their own frustrations, their own hopes. Jasmine Crockett became more than a public servant. She became a vessel for those who felt voiceless. For the immigrant who worked 3 jobs and still struggled to be seen as American enough. For the single mother who fought every day just to keep the lights on. For the student drowning in debt but refusing to give up on a dream. She carried their stories with her, weaving them into every stand she took. And with every uphill climb, she built something far more powerful than privilege. She built credibility. Not the kind bought with donations or inherited connections, but the kind forged in fire, proven through scars. She didn't just say she understood the struggles of ordinary people. She had lived them. That authenticity couldn't be faked, and it made her dangerous to men like Trump, whose power relied on spectacle rather than substance. So when her journey brought her into the national spotlight, she wasn't intimidated. She was ready. She had been underestimated her entire life, and every time, she had turned doubt into fuel. Facing Trump was just the largest version of a fight she had been waging since the beginning, standing against arrogance with dignity, against entitlement with determination. Cinematic images of her past collided with the present moment, the long nights under dim lamps, the lonely walks home after defeats, the quiet victories nobody celebrated but her. All of it built to this confrontation. For her, Trump's sneer was nothing new. She had seen it before in professors who told her she'd never make it, in colleagues who assumed she didn't belong, in adversaries who mocked her for daring to challenge them. And each time, she hadn't cowered. She had risen. That's why when Trump leaned forward, jabbing his finger like he always did, trying to diminish her with the weight of his name and legacy, Jasmine didn't flinch. To him, it was the same script he had played 1,000 times. Intimidate, mock, dominate. But to her, it was familiar, not frightening. She knew that look, that tone, that arrogance. It was the face of every gatekeeper she had ever outlasted, and in that moment, she didn't see intimidation, she saw opportunity. Asterisk, the chamber was no longer a room. It was a battlefield. Not of fists or bullets, but of words sharpened like knives. The camera zoomed closer. The microphones hissed as they picked up every cough, every shuffle, every muttered aside. This was no longer politics. This was theater. And at the center of the stage stood 2 figures who couldn't be more different. Donald Trump, brimming with arrogance, and Jasmine Crockett, calm but coiled like a spring. Trump leaned back in his chair, lips curled into a familiar sneer. He thrived on this atmosphere. Chaos was his oxygen. He knew how to command a crowd, not with facts, not with reason, but with spectacle. And tonight, he thought, would be no different. Look at her. Trump's voice carried across the room, smug and deliberate. A lightweight, a nobody. She's only here because people feel sorry for her. He paused, letting the words sting, then added with that trademark smirk, frankly, she should be thanking me for even acknowledging her existence. Gasps rippled. Some chuckles too, his loyalists couldn't resist. Trump had drawn first blood, but Crockett didn't flinch. Not a blink, not a wince. She remained perfectly still, eyes fixed, posture firm, as if she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. The silence of her composure was louder than Trump's insults. Asterisk. The cameras picked it up instantly, a split screen, Trump gesturing wildly, eyes bulging, arms flailing. Crockett unmoving, statuesque, steady as granite. The contrast was damning. Trump doubled down, irritated that his words hadn't provoked. He jabbed a finger in her direction, voice growing louder, rougher. You're a fraud. You talk about law and justice, but you don't know the first thing about either. You stand up here pretending to care about the people, but all you care about is yourself. You're nothing but a puppet. A disgrace. Reporters scribbled furiously. The air bristled. Each insult was a spark in a room soaked with gasoline, and still, Crockett did not move. Her stillness wasn't weakness. It was control. It was strategy. Like a chess master who allows the opponent to burn energy to overextend. Knowing the decisive counterstrike is coming behind Trump, supporters began to clap and cheer. The noise swelled. It was intimidation by volume. The kind of cacophony designed to rattle, to make an opponent lose footing. Trump basked in it, stretching his arms as though commanding an orchestra of chaos. This was his world. The louder, the better. But the crowd, the ones not fully his, were beginning to shift. Viewers at home noticed too. There was something almost desperate in Trump's rhythm, a man trying too hard to land blows that didn't connect. And there was something magnetic about Crockett's silence. It wasn't passivity. It was anticipation. The longer she waited, the more unbearable the tension became. Narrator voiceover. Almost whispering, the crowd leaned forward. Sensing something was about to snap, Trump tried again, louder, crueler. You don't belong here. You'll never belong here. People like you, they're the reason this country is falling apart. Weak, bitter, angry. Losers. That's all you'll ever be. The last word, losers, hung heavy in the air. He loved that word. He wielded it like a brand, a scarlet letter to mark anyone who dared challenge him. But something was different this time. The insult didn't land. Instead, the silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, Trump's words seemed smaller, hollow, as though the weight of his mockery was bouncing back on him. Crockett inhaled. A subtle movement, but one that shifted the entire room. Heads turned. Pens hovered. The noise died down, so even Trump's supporters sensed what was coming. She placed her hands on the table in front of her, steady and firm, not clenched, not trembling, grounded, eyes locked on Trump, unwavering. And for the first time that night, he hesitated. Just a flicker, just a second, but it was enough. He had unleashed everything in his arsenal, and she was still standing, untouched. The energy flipped. It was no longer Trump's show. The spectacle was hers now, narrator rising with the tension, and then Crockett dropped the words no one expected. The crowd held its breath. The cameras zoomed tighter. Trump leaned forward, bracing, and Crockett, calm, steady, unshaken, opened her mouth, but she didn't raise her voice. She didn't match his fury. Her words were measured, precise. She looked him dead in the eye and said, "You are evil." Asterisk for a heartbeat. Time froze. "You are evil." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, echoing through the chamber. They weren't shouted. They weren't barked. They were delivered with a calm precision that cut sharper than any scream ever could. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her gaze was locked, steady, unyielding. The pause that followed was unbearable, the silence after lightning. Before the rumble of thunder shakes the earth, Trump chuckled. That familiar dismissive laugh, the one he'd perfected on countless debate stages and rallies. To him, this was nothing but another insult, another attempt to rattle him. He leaned back in his chair, smirk plastered across his face, exuding overconfidence. Evil? That's the best you've got? He sneered, his voice laced with condescension, but Crockett didn't fire back immediately. She let the silence work for her. The cameras caught it, Trump shifting, grinning wide, convinced she'd stumbled. And then she spoke. "No," she said, her tone clear, steady. "It's not just a word. It's what you've chosen to be." Murmurs swept the room. Phones shot up into the air. Screens glowed as thousands began recording, posting, tweeting in real time. #URVEL was born in seconds. Crockett's voice sharpened. Evil is lying to the people who trusted you, who believed you when you said you'd fight for them, when all you did was fight for yourself. Evil is exploiting their pain, their fear, their struggles, so you could build your empire of chaos, Gasps, whispers, the sound of furious typing. Reporters were no longer just observers. They were participants, chronicling a moment that felt like history. Trump straightened in his seat. The smirk faltered, ever so slightly. His eyes narrowed. He reached for the microphone, but Crockett pressed on. Her words layering like a hammer striking nail after nail. Evil is dividing America just to feed your ego. You turned neighbor against neighbor. You told people their enemies were next door. When the truth was there, real enemy was sitting in gold towers. Laughing while families tore each other apart, the crowd murmured louder now, a wave of energy building. The chamber felt alive, charged. Trump's hand twitched on the microphone. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. He looked to the audience, searching for support, for laughter, for applause. But even some of his staunchest allies stayed still. Their eyes darted, unsettled. Something had shifted. Crockett leaned forward, her calm composure like a blade slicing through the chaos. Her tone didn't rise. It steadied. It anchored. You call yourself a man of law and order, but you've been indicted more times than you can count. You call yourself a man of family values, but the scandals that follow you tell another story. You call yourself strong, but bullies aren't strong. They're weak. They prey on others to hide their own fear. The audience broke into low gasps. Someone in the back muttered, "Wow." Another whisper, "She's ending him," on screens across America. Live tweets flashed. Jasmine just body slammed Trump with facts. #You are evil. This is history unfolding in real time. Goosebumps. Trump looked shook. I've never seen him like this. Trump's face flushed. The redness crept up his neck, into his cheeks. His hands fidgeted, restless, fingers tapping the table. He tried to laugh again, but the chuckle was thin, nervous, strained. He finally found his voice, stammering. That's ridiculous. I've done more for this country than anyone. Anyone. And you're... He waved his hand, searching for a word, but none came. Crockett cut in, firm but calm. You're right about one thing. You've done more than anyone. More to divide us. More to disgrace us. More to weaken the very democracy you swore to defend. Boom. The crowd erupted in murmurs. The sound was no longer just reaction. It was validation. People weren't just listening. They were agreeing. Trump tried again, louder, but the rhythm was gone. His sentences broke apart, half thoughts and fragments. He gestured wildly, the image of control slipping through his fingers. For the first time, Donald Trump, master of spectacle, looked rattled, and Crockett. She didn't raise her voice, didn't lean into fury. She dismantled him brick by brick, calmly, methodically. You call me weak? I've lived through struggle you could never imagine. I've fought battles you would never survive. You inherited wealth. I inherited nothing but grit. That's why I stand here, unshaken. That's why you're crumbling before the truth. The chamber shook with murmurs, a wave rolling from one side to the other. Some clapped. Others gasped. Reporters typed furiously. Headlines already forming. Crockett calls out Trump. You are evil. Trump's eyes darted. His voice cracked, his once dominant presence shrinking under the weight of Crockett's precision. He tried one last desperate jab. You're just angry. You're an angry woman, *. But Crockett cut through with a single glance, her voice razor sharp. No, I'm not angry. I'm resolute. There's a difference. The crowd roared, not with laughter, not with boos, but with a surge of approval. A collective exhale of pent-up tension. And then came the moment. The moment every replay, every highlight reel, every TikTok edit would circle around. Crockett leaned back, her final words deliberate, heavy with finality. *, you built your power on fear and lies. But fear crumbles. Lies collapse. And in the end, truth always stands taller. That's why tonight doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people. And it belongs to me. She pointed not with her finger, but with her presence. Calm, unshaken, undeniable, *, the cameras zoomed in one last time. Trump sat frozen, red-faced, fumbling with his hands. He looked small, not in stature, but in spirit. Narrator voice, soft yet triumphant. And in that instant, the room didn't belong to Trump anymore. It belonged to Jasmine Crockett. The words were still echoing in the chamber when the digital world erupted. "You are evil." 3 syllables had detonated across the internet like a flash grenade, impossible to ignore. Within minutes, Twitter feeds exploded. Hashtag You're Evil trended not just in the United States, but worldwide. By the end of the hour, hashtag Crockett vs. Trump had joined it. Rocketing to the top of trending lists from Washington to Warsaw. Clips of the exchange flooded timelines. Some were raw, shaky phone recordings from inside the chamber. Others were crisp cuts from live stream feeds. But all of them carried the same electric moment: Crockett's pause. Her calm delivery, the smirk on Trump's face evaporating into stunned silence. On TikTok, edits were instant. The clip was set to dramatic soundtracks, slowed down for effect. Words flashing across the screen like they were etched in fire. "You are evil." One viral remix placed Crockett's words over Hans Zimmer music. Another cut Trump's faltering response into a loop of stammers. Within hours, tens of millions of views piled up. Teenagers, activists, comedians, even apolitical creators joined in. It was no longer just politics, it was pop culture. Instagram Reels spread memes faster than fact-checkers could keep up. Screenshots of Trump's flushed face circulated with captions. When the truth finally hits, another viral image split the screen. One half Trump's scowl, the other Crockett's steady gaze. The text read, "Fear versus resolve." Late-night comedians had a feast. One host replayed the moment, paused it, and quipped, "That was the exact second Trump remembered what accountability feels like." Another joked, "We finally found his kryptonite, a woman who doesn't flinch." The audience roared with laughter, applause breaking through the punchlines. But it wasn't just entertainment. Commentators across the political spectrum weighed in. Progressive pundits called it the moment Crockett cemented her place as a rising star. "It's not about the insult," one analyst said on primetime television. "It's about the moral clarity." She named what millions feel but rarely hear said aloud. Conservatives were livid. Right-wing talk shows called it disrespectful, unhinged. Proof of the radical left. Yet even some critics grudgingly admitted Crockett had struck a nerve. One commentator, usually hostile to Democrats, muttered, "She had her facts straight." Trump wasn't ready for that, and celebrities, always the accelerants in cultural wildfire, joined the chorus. A-list actors, musicians, athletes shared the clip with simple captions. "Courage," she said what we were all thinking. A Grammy-winning singer tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just gave me goosebumps." That's leadership. The wave was unstoppable. Hashtags turned into slogans. Slogans turned into merchandise. T-shirts, mugs, posters appeared overnight. Crockett's silhouette with bold letters beneath, "You are evil." Activists adopted it as a rallying cry, using it in marches, printing it on placards, chanting it in the streets. Meanwhile, inside Trump's circle, chaos brewed. Advisors scrambled to spin the moment as nothing more than political theater. Spokespeople hit the airwaves, insisting Crockett's words were baseless, that Trump was the victim of a smear campaign. But the image of his stunned face was impossible to erase. For once, his bluster had failed him, and America had watched. Behind closed doors, reports leaked of Trump's fury. He allegedly shouted at aides, demanding to know why the microphones weren't cut, why the moderators didn't step in. "She ambushed me," he barked, though everyone knew it was no ambush at all. It was truth, delivered calmly in front of the world. And yet the real shock wasn't just the noise online. It wasn't the memes, the merchandise, or the headlines. It was what began happening in the days that followed. Supporters of Crockett, many who had felt invisible for years, suddenly felt seen. Immigrants, women, working-class Americans flooded social media with their own stories. They connected her words to their lived realities, bosses who demeaned them, politicians who ignored them, systems that devalued them. One post went viral, A young Latina wrote, "When she said you were evil, I thought of every time someone told me I wasn't enough. Today, I felt like someone fought for me. Another came from a veteran. I served this country. For years I've watched it erode under lies. Tonight Crockett reminded me why I fought. Dignity is still alive. Politicians couldn't ignore it." Allies rallied behind Crockett, praising her courage on the House floor and across Sunday shows. Even some cautious moderates leaned in, noting that her words tapped into something deeper than partisanship, a cry for accountability. And then came the polls. Within a week, surveys showed Crockett's favorability climbing. She was no longer just a sharp freshman lawmaker. She was a national figure, a name recognized in households that had never heard of her before. Trump's numbers, meanwhile, dipped slightly. Not catastrophic, but noticeable. Enough for strategists to whisper. This one landed. The shockwaves didn't stop at politics. University classrooms dissected the exchange as a study in rhetoric and power dynamics. Editorials argued over whether "you are evil" was too blunt or exactly what America needed. Podcasts devoted entire episodes to breaking down the pause, the delivery, the impact. It wasn't just a moment anymore. It was a movement. Narrator's voice, low and measured. The internet moved on to the next meme, the next distraction. But for millions, that night didn't fade. Because they knew this wasn't just about one insult in one chamber. It was about calling corruption by its name. It was about truth delivered without fear. And then the final turn. A whisper of suspense. But the real shock wasn't the reactions online. It wasn't the laughter on late-night TV or the trending hashtags. The real shock came in the days after. When what had begun as words turned into something no one could have predicted, asterisk for days. The replay looped on cable news and classrooms, on phones held by strangers on subways, but the question lingered. Was "you are evil" just a searing insult? Or was it something more? Jasmine Crockett answered that herself. When asked if she regretted her words, she didn't dodge, didn't soften. She leaned into the microphone and said, "This was never about one man. Evil isn't a person. Evil is what happens when corruption goes unchecked, when arrogance tramples dignity, when cruelty pretends to wear a crown." That's what I named that night. Her voice carried beyond politics. It was the tone of someone who understood that America's greatest battles aren't fought with armies, but with courage, ordinary courage that refuses to bow to power. Crockett reframed the moment. Not as a clash of personalities, but as a moral reckoning. She wasn't sparring with Donald Trump alone. She was sparring with every force that had made millions of Americans feel invisible. The lies that pit neighbor against neighbor, the greed that hollowed out communities, the arrogance that told working families their pain was just collateral damage. "Evil is not disagreement," she said in another interview. "Evil is when leaders use their power to divide, exploit, and destroy what makes this country whole. And dignity is when we stand together and refuse to let them win." Asterisk, that distinction resonated. It turned her words from a clapback into a compass. People who had laughed at the viral clip found themselves thinking deeper. Wasn't that the real choice before the country? Not red versus blue, but dignity versus arrogance. Not left versus right, but compassion versus cruelty. Churches quoted her in Sunday sermons. Teachers played the clip to spark classroom debates about ethics and leadership. Activists stitched her words into banners that read, "Evil is corruption. Dignity is resistance." What began as 3 sharp words became a rallying cry for something larger. The demand for truth. Even when it cuts, the emotional crescendo was undeniable. For once, it wasn't dynasty or wealth that commanded the stage. It was resilience, a reminder that someone without inherited power could still hold the powerful accountable. That mattered, because millions saw themselves in her. Narrator's voice rose, steady and strong. Her words weren't just a clapback. They were a mirror, forcing America to decide what side of history it wanted to be on. The side that excused arrogance, or the side that believed dignity could still win. In the end, the phrase "you are evil" wasn't about Donald Trump alone. It was about something older and larger. The arrogance that poisons democracy. The cruelty that silences the vulnerable. And Crockett's calm defiance reminded people that those forces don't vanish on their own. They're confronted, named, and beaten back only when someone dares to speak without fear. And so the moral of that night crystallized. Dignity triumphs not because it shouts the loudest, but because it speaks the truth without trembling. Courage doesn't always look like fury. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Sometimes it sounds like 3 words spoken so plainly they leave the room shaking. Asterisk. What Crockett proved was that history doesn't just belong to the powerful. It belongs to those who refuse to be intimidated. To those who remind us that evil, in all its disguises, shrinks when confronted by truth, and that truth is what carried forward. Not just for her, not just for that chamber, but for a nation still deciding what kind of story it wants to tell. You are evil. 3 words meant to wound, to spark outrage, to silence. And yet in Jasmine Crockett's hands, they became something else entirely. They became freedom. They became clarity. They became a mirror, reflecting not just one man's corruption, but an entire system's arrogance. Trump thought the insult would bounce back at her, but the smirk on his face would prove her powerless. Instead, those words exposed him, stripped him of the armor of dynasty and wealth, and revealed what millions had long felt but rarely heard said so plainly. Because in the end, this was never about 2 people trading insults in a chamber. It was about a deeper choice. Courage over corruption, dignity over dynasty, truth over arrogance. Crockett's calm defiance reminded us that when power goes unchecked, it takes only one steady voice to name it for what it is. And in that naming, a nation found its reflection. A reminder that arrogance crumbles when confronted with truth. And that dignity, no matter how underestimated, always leaves the stronger mark. If you believe truth must always speak, louder than arrogance, share this story. If you believe courage still matters in a country that sometimes feels divided beyond repair, subscribe for more. Moments where justice wins and arrogance falls. Because this wasn't just about Crockett versus Trump. It was about every fight where dignity is underestimated, every struggle where truth is dismissed, and every time it's about who dares to stand steady when the powerful smirk. Final shot? Jasmine Crockett, walking with calm resolve, the chamber echoing with her words. Behind her, Donald Trump sits shaken, the smirk gone. Truth had spoken, and it would not be silenced.